We live in an age where love has been stripped of its mystery and reconstructed as something to be displayed, measured, and optimized. What was once the most intimate and transformative human experience has been reduced to a series of gestures performed for an audience, real or imagined. The contemporary subject no longer loves in the traditional sense, but rather curates a version of love that can be exhibited, validated, and consumed. This is not merely a shift in romantic behavior, but a fundamental transformation in how we relate to others and to ourselves. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han has identified this phenomenon as part of a broader cultural crisis, one in which the erosion of otherness and the tyranny of transparency have rendered genuine intimacy nearly impossible. The transformation of love into performance begins with the rise of what Han calls the achievement society. Unlike disciplinary societies of the past, which operated through prohibition and constraint, achievement societies function through positivity and excess. We are no longer subjects who are forbidden, but subjects who are compelled to achieve, to optimize, to perform. This logic has infiltrated every domain of human existence, including the realm of love and relationships. The lover is now expected to be an entrepreneur of the self, constantly working on personal development, emotional intelligence, and relational skills. Love becomes another project, another arena for self-optimization. The question is no longer whether two people can surrender to each other, but whether they can perform the roles of ideal partners with maximum efficiency. This performance anxiety is amplified by digital technology and social media, which have created an unprecedented regime of visibility. Every aspect of romantic life can now be documented, shared, and evaluated by others. Couples post photographs of their dates, anniversaries, and intimate moments, transforming private experiences into public spectacles. These images are carefully curated to project an idealized version of love, one that conforms to aesthetic and emotional standards dictated by the platform. The likes, comments, and shares that follow serve as metrics of relational success, creating a feedback loop in which love is validated not by the depth of connection, but by its visibility and approval from others. The other person in the relationship becomes less a partner in intimacy and more a collaborator in the production of a public image. Han argues that this regime of visibility is not merely superficial, but fundamentally destructive to the erotic and the intimate. Love requires a certain opacity, a space of unknowing where the other remains genuinely other. Eroticism, in its traditional sense, depends on distance, on the presence of something withheld, something that cannot be fully grasped or consumed. The digital age, however, operates according to the logic of transparency and total exposure. Everything must be made visible, knowable, and available. In such a world, the mystery that sustains desire evaporates. The other is no longer a source of fascination, but an object to be analyzed, evaluated, and, if necessary, replaced. Dating apps epitomize this logic, reducing potential partners to profiles that can be swiped through with the same casualness one might browse products on an online marketplace. The pornographication of culture has further accelerated this process. Han uses the term pornography not merely to refer to explicit sexual content, but to describe a broader cultural condition in which everything is exposed to the point of obscenity. Pornography eliminates narrative, context, and ambiguity, presenting bodies and acts in their most direct and unmediated form. This logic has seeped into everyday life, where relationships are increasingly stripped of the rituals, hesitations, and uncertainties that once gave them depth. Speed dating, hookup culture, and the pressure to immediately assess compatibility all reflect a pornographic mentality that seeks instant gratification and maximum efficiency. The slow unfolding of intimacy, the gradual revelation of another person, the patience required to truly know someone, all of this is experienced as an intolerable delay. At the heart of this transformation is a crisis of otherness. For Han, genuine love requires the experience of the other as truly other, as someone who disrupts our narcissistic self-enclosure and forces us to confront something beyond ourselves. In the achievement society, however, the other is increasingly reduced to a mirror, a confirmation of our own identity and desires. We seek partners who validate us, who fit neatly into our life plans, who do not challenge or disturb us in fundamental ways. This is not love, but a form of narcissistic consumption. The other becomes an extension of the self, valued only to the extent that they enhance our self-image and contribute to our project of self-optimization. When they fail to do so, they are discarded and replaced with someone more suitable. This narcissistic structure is reinforced by the language of contemporary psychology and self-help culture, which frames relationships primarily in terms of individual needs and personal growth. We are told to prioritize self-love, to set boundaries, to ensure that our partners meet our emotional needs. While these concepts have value, they can also obscure the more radical demand that love makes upon us, the demand to surrender something of ourselves, to be transformed by the encounter with another. Love, in its deepest sense, is not about finding someone who completes us, but about being shattered and remade through the experience of otherness. It is a rupture, a risk, a loss of control. The contemporary emphasis on emotional safety and compatibility can function as a defense against this more unsettling dimension of love. The performance of love also manifests in the multiplication of romantic rituals that have been emptied of meaning and transformed into obligatory gestures. Anniversaries, Valentine's Day, elaborate proposals, all of these are increasingly experienced not as spontaneous expressions of affection, but as duties to be fulfilled, performances to be executed according to social expectations. The gesture itself matters less than its documentation and display. A proposal is not complete until it has been photographed and shared online. An anniversary dinner is not successful unless it generates the appropriate amount of envy and admiration from one social network. These rituals, which once marked significant moments in the private life of a couple, have become primarily oriented toward an external audience, performances staged for the validation of others. The consequence of this performative turn is a profound exhaustion. Han describes the contemporary subject as suffering from what he calls achievement depression, a condition that arises not from external oppression, but from the relentless pressure to optimize and perform. In the context of love, this manifests as a chronic dissatisfaction, a sense that one's relationship is never quite adequate, never quite measuring up to the idealized images that circulate on social media. Couples compare their private realities to the curated highlights of others and inevitably find themselves lacking. This comparison generates anxiety, resentment, and a restless search for something better. The grass is always greener, not because relationships have genuinely deteriorated, but because the standard against which they are measured has become impossibly inflated. This exhaustion is compounded by the sheer labor involved in maintaining a relationship in the digital age. Communication that was once occasional and spontaneous has become constant and mandatory. Partners are expected to be perpetually available, to respond immediately to messages, to provide continuous affirmation and attention. The boundaries between togetherness and separateness have collapsed, leaving little room for solitude or the kind of productive distance that can actually strengthen a relationship. The result is a paradoxical situation in which people feel simultaneously overconnected and profoundly alone. They are in constant contact but lack genuine intimacy. They share everything but reveal nothing essential. Han suggests that this situation is not merely a matter of individual psychology, but reflects deeper structural changes in how society is organized. The neoliberal economic order has transformed every aspect of life into a site of production and accumulation. Just as workers are expected to be constantly productive and entrepreneurial, lovers are expected to constantly invest in their relationships, to work on themselves, to generate emotional capital. Love becomes another form of labor, another domain in which one must strive, compete, and achieve. The romantic partner is both a collaborator in this project and a potential competitor, someone against whom one must measure one's performance. This economic logic poisons intimacy at its root, making it nearly impossible to experience the kind of surrender and vulnerability that genuine love requires. The question then becomes whether love can survive under these conditions, or whether it has been so thoroughly colonized by the logic of performance that recovery is impossible. Han is not entirely pessimistic, but his diagnosis suggests that any solution must be radical rather than reformist. It is not enough to simply use social media more mindfully or to carve out quality time with one's partner. The problem is not one of moderation, but of structure. As long as the fundamental logic of transparency, optimization, and performance remains intact, love will continue to be distorted and diminished. What is required is nothing less than a transformation in how we understand ourselves and our relation to others. One possible path forward involves recovering what Han calls negativity, not in the sense of pessimism or cruelty, but in the sense of that which resists total integration and transparency. Negativity is the presence of the other as genuinely other, as something that cannot be fully known, controlled, or consumed. It is the space of mystery, ambiguity, and uncertainty that the contemporary regime of positivity seeks to eliminate. To love authentically, we must be willing to encounter this negativity, to accept that the other person will always exceed our understanding, will always retain an element of inscrutability. This requires patience, humility, and a willingness to tolerate frustration and not knowing. It also requires a different relationship to time. The pornographic logic of contemporary culture demands immediate satisfaction and instant results. Everything must happen now, must be available on demand. Genuine love, however, unfolds slowly. It requires duration, repetition, and the accumulation of shared experiences over time. It cannot be rushed or optimized. The rituals that once structured romantic life, courtship, engagement, marriage, were not merely arbitrary social conventions, but temporal frameworks that allowed love to develop at its own pace. The contemporary emphasis on efficiency and speed undermines these temporal structures, leaving relationships without the scaffolding they need to grow deep roots. Recovering a capacity for genuine love also means resisting the narcissistic impulse to view the other primarily as a source of validation or self-enhancement. This is perhaps the most difficult challenge, because narcissism is not merely an individual failing, but a structural feature of contemporary culture. We are constantly encouraged to think of ourselves as brands, to curate our identities, to maximize our visibility and appeal. In such a context, the other person inevitably becomes an accessory to this project, valued for what they contribute to our image rather than for who they are in themselves. Breaking free from this logic requires a deliberate effort to see the other not as a mirror, but as a genuine alterity, someone who can challenge and disrupt our self-enclosure. This might mean choosing relationships that are less comfortable, less immediately gratifying, less aligned with our predetermined preferences. It might mean staying with difficulty rather than quickly moving on when things become challenging. It might mean accepting that a partner will not always meet our needs, will sometimes disappoint or frustrate us, and that this is not a failure, but an essential dimension of relating to someone who is genuinely other. The contemporary emphasis on compatibility and emotional fulfillment can function as a way of avoiding this more demanding encounter with otherness. Another crucial element involves reclaiming privacy and opacity in an age of total exposure. This does not mean secrecy or dishonesty, but rather recognizing that not everything needs to be shared, documented, or made visible to others. The intimate life of a couple should have boundaries, spaces that are protected from the intrusive gaze of social media and the judgments of the crowd. This privacy is not a withdrawal from the world, but a precondition for genuine intimacy. When everything is exposed, nothing remains sacred. When every moment is documented for an audience, spontaneity and authenticity become impossible. Creating spaces of genuine privacy requires conscious discipline in an age that pathologizes any form of hiddenness or reserve. This also means developing a different relationship to validation and external approval. The need for likes, comments, and shares is not merely a harmless quirk, but a profound symptom of ontological insecurity. When our sense of self depends on constant external confirmation, we become trapped in a cycle of performance and anxiety. Breaking free requires cultivating an internal locus of validation, a sense of self-worth that does not depend on the judgments of others. In the context of love, this means valuing the relationship for what it is in itself, rather than for how it appears to others. It means finding satisfaction in private moments of connection rather than in their public display. The recovery of genuine love also demands a confrontation with what Han calls the smoothness of contemporary existence. Everything in the achievement society is designed to minimize friction, to eliminate obstacles, to make experience as seamless and efficient as possible. Dating apps allow us to filter potential partners according to precise criteria. Algorithms predict compatibility. Communication technologies eliminate the delays and uncertainties that once characterized romantic correspondence. But this smoothness comes at a cost. It is precisely the rough edges, the difficulties, the moments of resistance and incomprehension that generate depth in relationships. When everything flows too easily, nothing leaves a mark. The other person becomes just another smooth surface we glide across without ever really touching. This smoothness is related to what Han identifies as the crisis of Eros in contemporary culture. Eros, in the classical sense, is not merely sexual desire, but a force that drives us beyond ourselves, that creates tension and longing. It requires distance and separation. We desire what we do not have, what is not immediately available, what remains partly hidden. The contemporary regime of total availability and instant access undermines this erotic structure. When everything is immediately accessible, when potential partners are just a swipe away, when sexual encounters can be arranged with the efficiency of ordering food delivery, the space for longing and desire collapses. We become trapped in what Han calls a hell of the same, endlessly consuming experiences that fail to truly satisfy because they lack the dimension of otherness that makes satisfaction possible. The pornographic gaze, which reduces everything to surface and immediate visibility, is the enemy of Eros. Pornography presents bodies as fully known, completely exposed, with no remainder of mystery or ambiguity. It eliminates narrative, context, and the slow revelation that characterizes genuine seduction. When this logic extends beyond explicit sexual content to encompass the whole of culture, it creates a world in which nothing can truly seduce us, because seduction requires precisely what pornography eliminates: distance, indirectness, the play of veiling and unveiling. To recover Eros means recovering the capacity to be seduced, to be drawn towards something that is not immediately given, that requires patience and imagination to approach. This suggests that genuine love might require a kind of asceticism, a deliberate practice of restraint and withdrawal in an age of excess and overavailability. This is not about moralism or puritanism, but about recognizing that abundance can be as destructive as scarcity. When we have too many options, when everything is available all the time, choice itself becomes paralyzing and meaningless. The ascetic gesture is not a denial of pleasure, but a refusal of the logic that says more is always better, that access must be immediate, that every desire must be instantly gratified. It is the creation of boundaries, limits, and spaces of non-availability that paradoxically make genuine availability possible. In practical terms, this might mean consciously limiting one's presence on dating apps, resisting the temptation to constantly scan for better options, committing to relationships even when they become difficult or boring. It might mean turning off phones during intimate moments, refusing to document every experience for social media, protecting certain aspects of one's relationship from the intrusive gaze of others. These seem like small gestures, but they represent a fundamental challenge to the logic of total transparency and availability that governs contemporary culture. There are ways of saying that not everything is for sale, not everything is available, not everything can be optimized and made efficient. Han's analysis also points toward the importance of ritual and form in sustaining love over time. Contemporary culture tends to view rituals as empty conventions, ossified traditions that constrain authentic expression. But this misunderstands the function of ritual. Rituals are not opposed to authenticity, but rather create the structure within which authentic experience becomes possible. They provide a framework that supports continuity and meaning across time. Without ritual, every moment must be spontaneous. Every interaction must be freshly negotiated. Every gesture must prove its authenticity. This is exhausting and ultimately impossible. Rituals allow us to express love without having to constantly reinvent it, to maintain connection even when we do not feel particularly inspired or creative. The challenge is to recover genuine rituals rather than the empty performances that pass for ritual in contemporary culture. A genuine ritual is not performed for an audience, but emerges from and serves the relationship itself. It creates a rhythm and a structure that holds the couple together across time. This might be as simple as a regular walk together, a weekly dinner without phones, a bedtime conversation. What matters is not the specific content, but the consistency and the intention, the way the ritual creates a protected space within the chaos of contemporary life. These rituals resist the logic of optimization because they are not means to an end, but ends in themselves, moments valued simply for being rather than for producing some outcome. Another dimension of recovering genuine love involves rethinking the relationship between love and freedom. Contemporary culture tends to frame freedom primarily in negative terms, as the absence of constraint and obligation. We are free to the extent that we can do what we want, choose what we prefer, leave when we are unsatisfied. This understanding of freedom is deeply compatible with consumer capitalism, which requires mobile, flexible subjects who are always ready to exchange one option for another. But this freedom is also profoundly lonely and ultimately empty, because it never commits to anything, never risks itself, never allows itself to be truly transformed. Genuine love suggests a different understanding of freedom, one that involves commitment, obligation, and even a certain bondage. This is not the bondage of oppression, but what we might call a chosen binding, a decision to limit one's options, to close off certain possibilities in order to open up others. When we commit to another person, we accept constraints on our freedom to pursue other relationships, to prioritize our individual desires above all else, to remain perpetually mobile and uncommitted. But this limitation is not a loss, but a transformation of freedom. We become free to develop depth, to build something that requires time and consistency, to experience the kind of intimacy that only emerges when we stop keeping our options open. This understanding of commitment is increasingly difficult to sustain in a culture that pathologizes any form of binding or limitation. We are constantly warned against losing ourselves in relationships, against sacrificing our individual identity, against staying in situations that do not serve our personal growth. This advice is not wrong, but can also function as a defense against the genuine risk that love requires. To love is precisely to allow oneself to be changed, to have one's identity disrupted, to discover that one's neat plans for self-development must be negotiated with another person who has their own plans and needs. The difficulty of sustaining genuine love in the contemporary moment also relates to what Han identifies as the disappearance of the other in late capitalist society. The other, in Han's analysis, is not simply another person, but represents a fundamental category of experience, the encounter with something that resists assimilation into our existing frameworks of understanding. In traditional societies, otherness was a constant presence in the form of ritual obligations, divine commandments, social hierarchies, and moral laws that came from outside the self. These external structures limited individual freedom, but also provided meaning, orientation, and the experience of encountering something greater than oneself. In the achievement society, by contrast, the subject relates primarily to itself. There is no external authority, no transcendent order, only the imperative to optimize, achieve, and perform according to standards that the subject has internalized. This disappearance of otherness has profound consequences for love, because love, at its core, is an encounter with alterity. To love is to confront someone who cannot be reduced to an extension of oneself, who maintains their own irreducible difference. But when the other has been eliminated from culture more broadly, when we relate to everything as potential material for our projects of self-optimization, it becomes nearly impossible to experience another person as genuinely other. They become instead a factor in our personal growth, a component in our lifestyle, a resource to be managed and optimized. This is why so many contemporary relationships feel hollow despite being technically functional. They lack the dimension of otherness that gives love its transformative power. Recovering this dimension of otherness requires what we might call a practice of attention, a discipline of really seeing the other person rather than projecting our needs and expectations onto them. This is extraordinarily difficult in an age of distraction and multitasking, where sustained attention to anything has become rare. We check our phones during conversations, think about work during intimate moments, plan future activities while supposedly present to current ones. This fractured attention prevents us from truly encountering another person in their specificity and difference. The practice of attention means giving someone our full presence, not as a technique for improving the relationship, but as a way of honoring their otherness, of allowing them to appear as they are rather than as we wish them to be. This attention must extend not only to moments of pleasure and connection, but also to moments of conflict and incomprehension. Contemporary culture teaches us to avoid or quickly resolve conflict, to seek relationships characterized by ease and harmony. But conflict is often the moment when otherness becomes most visible, when we are forced to confront the fact that another person sees the world differently, values different things, has needs that may not align with ours. Rather than viewing these moments as failures to be overcome through better communication or compromise, we might see them as opportunities to genuinely encounter otherness. This does not mean embracing conflict for its own sake, but recognizing that a relationship without friction, without moments of genuine incomprehension, may be a relationship in which otherness has been eliminated in favor of narcissistic mirroring. Han's analysis also suggests that recovering genuine love requires confronting our fear of vulnerability and dependency. The achievement subject must be autonomous, self-sufficient, and invulnerable. Needing others is experienced as weakness, and emotional dependency is pathologized as unhealthy attachment. But love inevitably involves dependency and vulnerability. To love is to give another person the power to hurt us, to make our well-being dependent on their presence and actions, to acknowledge that we are not self-sufficient but fundamentally relational beings. The contemporary emphasis on self-love and independence, while containing important truths, can also function as a defense against this more radical vulnerability. We protect ourselves from disappointment by never fully investing, by maintaining an ironic distance, by keeping exit strategies always available. Breaking through this defensive posture requires courage and a willingness to risk genuine hurt. It means acknowledging that we cannot control how another person responds to us, that love always contains the possibility of rejection and loss, that opening ourselves to another means accepting a fundamental precariousness. This is terrifying in an age that seeks to eliminate all risk and uncertainty, that promises us control over every aspect of our lives. But without this risk, without this vulnerability, love remains a mere simulation, a performance we execute without ever truly exposing ourselves. The question of what to do about the transformation of love into performance does not admit of simple solutions or techniques. Han's analysis reveals that the problem is structural rather than individual, woven into the fundamental logic of contemporary society. This means that personal solutions, while important, are necessarily limited. An individual couple can choose to protect their privacy, to limit their use of social media, to practice attention and vulnerability, but they do so within a larger cultural context that constantly works against these choices. The pressure to perform, to optimize, to make everything visible and measurable does not come from individual failings, but from the structure of achievement society itself. Nevertheless, resistance remains possible, and perhaps the first step is simply recognizing the problem, becoming conscious of the ways in which the logic of performance has colonized our intimate lives. This awareness itself creates a small space of freedom, an opportunity to make different choices. We can decide not to post our relationship on social media, not because we are ashamed, but because we value its privacy. We can choose to stay with difficulty rather than immediately seeking a new partner when things become challenging. We can practice attention, vulnerability, and commitment as forms of resistance to a culture that values distraction and vulnerability and perpetual mobility. We can also seek to create small communities of practice, spaces where different values and ways of relating are cultivated and protected. This might be a circle of friends who have agreed to different norms around technology and visibility, a community that values depth over breadth, commitment over flexibility, privacy over transparency. These small spaces cannot transform the larger culture, but they can provide islands of refuge, contexts in which different possibilities for love and relationship can be explored and sustained. Ultimately, Han's analysis suggests that the recovery of genuine love is inseparable from a broader cultural and political transformation, a movement away from the logic of achievement, optimization, and performance towards something more human, more vulnerable, more open to otherness. This transformation will not be easy or quick, and it may not be fully possible within the current structure of society. But the alternative is to accept the continued hollowing out of one of the most essential human experiences, the reduction of love to a performance executed for an audience that can never be satisfied. If we are to have any hope of recovering genuine intimacy, we must begin by recognizing what has been lost and committing ourselves to the difficult work of reclaiming it. One relationship, one moment of genuine attention, one act of vulnerability at a time.